Today, we're jumping into the story of one of history's most powerful empires, a force that literally redrew the map of the world. But here's the thing, their story, how they rose and how they fell, it isn't just one single tale. It's actually two, and they couldn't be more different from each other. For 240 years, the Mongol Empire was just dominant. They created the largest single land empire the world has ever seen. We're talking from the frozen steppes of Siberia all the way to the heart of the Middle East. Their power was absolute. But you gotta ask, how? How did a nomadic people from the middle of nowhere achieve all this? Was it some kind of divine intervention, a punishment for a world that had gone astray? Or was it something else? A result of a brilliant, ruthless, revolutionary new system? Well, like we're about to see, the answer you get really depends on which story you choose to believe. Okay, so let's get into the first telling of the story. This perspective frames the whole Mongol invasion not as a simple military conquest, but as a divine reckoning, a test for a civilization that had totally lost its way. To understand this view, you have to picture the Muslim world in the early 13th century. It was massive, sure, but it was a house of cards. You had the Abbasids with a paper-thin army, the Khwarezmians were split between 17 different competing rulers, and everywhere you looked, the leadership was distracted by luxury and infighting, while their empires were literally crumbling. The whole situation was just ripe for a total collapse. So according to this narrative, the spark that lit the fuse came from this incredible weakness. In 1212, when Muslims in Spain begged for help, crickets, nobody answered the call. Then, just 6 years later, Genghis Khan sends a trade mission, just a peaceful delegation, and what happens? The local governor gets paranoid, thinks they're spies, and has them all executed. It was a massive insult, a fatal mistake that was about to unleash hell on earth. When Genghis Khan heard the news, the story goes that he climbed a mountain, prayed, and then unleashed a wave of fury that would change the world forever. His supposed words really captured the sheer scale of the revenge he was planning. So you see, from this viewpoint, the invasion wasn't just another war. It was a punishment. Scholars at the time, like the famous Ibn Kathir, basically argued that the Mongols were a force sent by God himself to teach a lesson to a people who had become sinful, disunited, and complacent. And this idea gets right to the heart of this whole perspective. Genghis Khan is even said to have told the people he conquered that he was there because of them, because of their actions. In their eyes, he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a consequence. Okay, but hold on, that's one powerful moral story. But what if the Mongol success had nothing to do with divine will at all? What if it was all about a groundbreaking and frankly, brutally efficient human system? And that brings us to perspective number 2. This version of the story pushes all the morality aside and instead focuses on the brilliant, ruthless, and just incredibly practical systems that Genghis Khan built. This is a story about logistics, strategy, and pure human ingenuity. So what was the secret sauce? Well, Genghis Khan's big idea was to completely shatter tradition. Before him, power was all about family ties. Your unqualified nephew could be a general. Khan said nope. He made it all about merit, about skill. A brilliant soldier from a humble background could become a top commander. And what does that do? It creates a command structure that is intensely loyal and ridiculously competent because every single one of those leaders owed their job directly to him. And get this, they didn't just conquer people, they absorbed them. They had this incredible system. First, they'd defeat a tribe. Then, they'd completely break up its social structure. Then, they'd scatter the survivors among their own Mongol units. And within a single generation, the children of their enemies grew up thinking of themselves as Mongols. It was literally a machine for turning enemies into assets. Their strategic genius really shines when you look at how they used winter. For basically every other army in history, winter meant you pack up and go home. But for the Mongols, who grew up in the Siberian cold, it was their home turf. They could move and attack all winter long while their enemies were stuck, frozen in place. They turned the harshest part of their environment into their single greatest weapon. So you have to wonder, if the Mongols were this unstoppable force, whether you see them as divine or just brilliantly organized, why did their empire eventually fall apart? Well, this is where our two stories actually start to line up and point to the same key moments. In the first story, the moral one, the beginning of the end came at a place called Ain Jalut. It's in modern-day Palestine. There, the Mamluk armies from Egypt did the impossible. They handed the Mongols their first major defeat in 60 years. That single battle shattered their whole aura of invincibility. It was proof, in that narrative, that a righteous and unified force could stand up to them. And at the exact same time, the empire was starting to crack from the inside. The Great Khan died, which set off a huge civil war over who would take over. And crucially, one of the top Mongol leaders, a guy named Berk Khan, had converted to Islam. He ended up declaring war on his own cousin, Hulagu Khan, for destroying Baghdad. For the first time, religion was dividing the Mongols at the very top. Now, from that second perspective, the systemic view, this kind of internal split was basically inevitable. The empire just got too big to manage as one entity. So by 1266, it was over. The unified empire was gone, and in its place were 4 smaller empires, or khanates, and each of these now had its own unique and ultimately fatal weakness. And if you dig into it, it's fascinating to see how each one failed for a completely different systemic reason. In China, the Yuan dynasty got bloated with bureaucracy. The Golden Horde in Russia ran out of places to raid, so the money stopped flowing and they turned on each other. In Persia, and this is my favorite detail, the Ilkhanate literally ran out of grass to feed their horses. Their whole military model collapsed. And finally, in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate just got outmatched by new technology, gunpowder. So at the end of the day, we're left with these 2 incredibly powerful, totally compelling explanations for the exact same set of historical events. One is a story of faith, morality, and fate. The other is a story of systems, strategy, and cold, hard logic. You know, one story is all about sin, punishment, and maybe even redemption. The other is about meritocracy, assimilation, and what happens when a system breaks down under its own weight. Both of them use the exact same facts, the executed envoys, that battle at Ain Jalut, the internal power struggles, but they weave them into completely different narratives about why it all happened. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Which story you find more convincing might say more about how you see the world than it does about the Mongols themselves. It really forces us to ask a huge question. Is history driven by some grand moral purpose, or is it all just about the cold, hard logic of systems we create? That's it for this explainer, which was based in
gunpowder in Europe, the Mughal Empire over in India, and the Japanese word kamikaze. It really does sound like the setup to a very weird joke, doesn't it? But the answer is actually one of the most powerful, most transformative forces in all of human history.
That's right, the Mongol Empire. For a brief, absolutely explosive period, this group of nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia completely reshaped the world in ways we are still feeling today.
So that's what we're going to dive into. We're going to look at exactly how this empire ballooned into the largest single land empire in history, and then how something so unbelievably vast and powerful just crumbled.
You know, every story like this has a beginning, and the Mongol Empire story starts with one man. And this wasn't a man born into some great power. This was a guy who seized it through sheer will and, frankly, brilliance. His name was Temujin.
I mean, Temujin's early life was just brutal. He was born back in 1162, and when he was only 9 years old, his father, a minor clan leader, was killed. And just like that, he and his family were cast out, left for dead on the incredibly harsh Mongolian steppe. But Temujin didn't just survive. He swore he'd get his revenge. For decades, he slowly gathered followers, he forged alliances, and by the time he was 40, he'd conquered all of his rivals. And so in 1206, all the Mongol clans got together for a great meeting, and they named him the Great Khan of all Mongols, Genghis Khan.
But how did he do it? Well, his secret weapon was a total break from tradition. You see, the old Mongol way was all about family. If you had a highborn but totally useless uncle, he could still be a general just because of his name. Genghis Khan threw that whole idea out the window. He built his new world on a radical concept: meritocracy. It didn't matter who your father was. If you were a brilliant soldier from a no-name family, you could become a general. In a world completely defined by who you were born as, this was unheard of. And it created an army that was not only incredibly skilled, but was also fiercely loyal, because every single person in a position of power owed it all directly to him.
Okay, so with the united people and a super loyal, merit-based army, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. And he didn't just build an army.
He built an unstoppable machine designed for one thing: conquest. This Mongol machine was basically built on 4 key pillars. First, they mastered winter warfare, attacking when other armies were freezing and stuck in their forts. Second, their horse archers were the stuff of legend. Unbelievable mobility, able to fire arrows on the move and outrun pretty much anyone. Third, and this is crucial, they assimilated the people and technologies they conquered. They'd grab Chinese siege engineers and Uyghur scribes and just make them part of the team. And finally, it was all fueled by a plunder economy. Constant war meant a constant flow of treasure to reward loyal followers, which of course meant the machine had to keep expanding, or it would literally run out of gas.
Their playbook for dealing with conquered peoples was systematic, to say the least. First, they conquer a tribe. Simple enough. Then, instead of letting them stick together, they would break them up and scatter individuals throughout their own nomadic groups, their hordes. Now, you're surrounded by Mongols, you have no one from your old life to talk to, you're basically forced to participate in Mongol culture. And over a generation, their kids just grew up as Mongols. And any tribes that played along got rewarded with land and loot. It was a brilliant, if absolutely ruthless, way to turn enemies into loyal subjects.
So how did they rule this ridiculously huge territory? Well, the Mongols had zero interest in settling down and becoming city dwellers, so they came up with the Mongol bureaucracy. Basically, conquered kings and local administrators got to keep ruling their own lands, but they had to join this council and rule on behalf of the Great Khan. And in exchange, they got a cut of the empire's massive wealth. It was a system where everyone in power had a real stake in making sure the expansion continued.
For decades, the Mongol Empire seemed totally invincible, like it was just destined to swallow the whole world. But even the greatest empires have a fatal flaw, and the Mongols' weakness was baked into its very structure from the beginning.
Under Mongol Khan, the last great leader to hold it all together, the Mongols hit their absolute peak. They truly believed it was their destiny to conquer everything, under this motto, one world, one ruler. The trade routes were so safe, they say a person could walk from Korea to Hungary without any fear of being robbed. But this incredible unity, it was about to completely shatter.
So here it is, the empire's Achilles heel, succession. Every single time a great Khan died, the entire empire would grind to a halt. All the important leaders had to ride all the way back to Mongolia for an election that could take years. And these so-called elections almost always turned into devastating civil wars that just paralyzed everything.
Well, after Mongol Khan died in 1259, the final, fatal civil war kicked off. When the dust finally settled, the unified empire was gone. It was shattered into 4 competing successor states called Khanats. Each one was ruled by a descendant of Genghis Khan, sure, but now they were rivals, not partners. The dream of one world, one ruler was officially dead.
From this point on, there really isn't one single story of the Mongol Empire's fall. Instead, you've got 4 different stories, as each of these new khanates faced its own unique set of challenges and ultimately met its own unique end.
So each khanate took a totally different path downhill. In China, the Yuan dynasty kind of became too Chinese. They lost their nomadic edge, and when the expansion stopped, the plunder stopped flowing. They were eventually overthrown by a native Chinese rebellion. In Russia, the Golden Horde was eaten alive by infighting between clans. This chaos allowed their Russian subjects to get stronger and stronger until they finally kicked them out. The Ilkhanate in Persia ended up controlling a lot of desert and mountains, land that just wasn't great for supporting nomadic hordes. This led to instability, resource shortages, and eventually it just collapsed. And finally, in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate simply ran out of time. They were made obsolete by guns, a technology that foot soldiers could use, but their famous horse archers couldn't. And after 500 years, they just sort of faded away, assimilating into the local cultures.
So the empire is gone, but its impact, its echo through time, is just massive. It directly shaped the world that we all live in today.
So let's circle all the way back to that question from the beginning. The Mongols connected east and west like nobody before, creating what we call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. This peace allowed technology, like gunpowder, to travel from China all the way to Europe, changing warfare forever. Their collapse created huge power vacuums, which allowed empires like the Ottomans and the Mongols, whose founder was a Mongol descendant, to rise up. Up north, the fall of the Golden Horde paved the way for a unified Russia to emerge as a major power. And yep, kamikaze, or divine wind, that's the Japanese name for the typhoons that famously wrecked two separate Mongol invasion fleets, saving Japan from being conquered.
You just have to let that sink in. Through a combination of brutality, genius, and just unbelievable force of will, this small group of nomads from the steppes achieved something that has never, ever been equaled. For a moment in time, they completely remade the world.
Their motto was, "One world, one ruler," and for a little while there, they almost pulled it off. It leaves us with a final, really big thought to chew on. The Mongols proved through conquest that a united world was at least possible. So why has it remained so difficult and maybe even so undesirable ever since?